Big Shaq was minding his own business when he saw something that made his blood boil. A police officer smirked as he found drugs near a black businessman's car. Drugs Shaq had just seen him plant. The officer pulled out his cuffs. The crowd watched, some recording, some too scared to move. But Shaq? He just smiled because he had a plan. What happened next flipped the entire system on its head, exposed corruption at the highest level, and sent one dirty cop straight to his worst nightmare. Stay till the end, because this story will leave you speechless. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. Shaquille O'Neal stood outside a bustling cafe, signing autographs and chatting with fans as the warm afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the city. The scent of fresh coffee and pastries filled the air, blending with the soft hum of conversations. It was a moment of peace, the kind that Shaq enjoyed when he wasn't in the spotlight. But that peace was shattered by the sudden blare of police sirens. Across the street, a sleek black sedan had been pulled over by a police cruiser. A well-dressed black man stepped out cautiously, his tailored Navy suit crisp, his posture straight. His name was Jonathan Carter, and even from a distance, Shaq could see the tension in his body. He wasn't scared, just wary. Officer Rick Dawson, a tall, broad-shouldered cop with a buzz cut, approached with calculated steps. He had the kind of smirk that made Shaq's stomach turn. It wasn't a friendly smirk. It was the smirk of a man who thought he had all the power. "Just a routine check," Dawson said, placing a firm hand on Jonathan's shoulder. Shaq frowned. The grip was unnecessary, too aggressive. Jonathan hadn't resisted. He hadn't even questioned the stop yet. Jonathan kept his voice level. "Is there a problem, officer?" Dawson chuckled under his breath, as if amused by the question. "No problem. If you cooperate, step aside." Jonathan hesitated, his brow furrowing. "Step aside for what?" Dawson's smirk twitched. "Just need to make sure everything's in order. You don't mind if I take a look inside your car, do you?" Jonathan glanced at his vehicle. "Unless there's a specific reason." Dawson's tone hardened. "You refusing, Mr. Carter?" Shaq's fingers tightened around his iced coffee. He'd seen situations like this before, seen how they could spiral out of control in seconds. His gut told him this wasn't about a routine check. Then in a blink, it happened. Dawson shifted slightly, his hand dipping into his pocket. His movement was swift, practiced. And then, just like that, a small plastic baggie landed near Jonathan's tire. Subtle, quick, almost unnoticeable. Almost. But Shaq saw it. His stomach clenched, his blood running hot. He'd played in high-stakes games his entire life, but nothing made his heart pound like the scene unfolding before him. Jonathan hadn't even noticed. He was too busy keeping his hands visible, too busy trying to de-escalate. Dawson stepped back, arms crossed. "Well, well, what do we have here?" His voice dripped with fake surprise as he pointed to the bag near the tire. Shaq's jaw tightened, his mind raced. Did Dawson really think no one had seen that? Did he think he could get away with this? The street had gone eerily quiet. A few pedestrians had slowed down, sensing the tension. But no one spoke, no one moved. Shaq exhaled slowly, his massive frame straightening. He stepped off the curb, heading straight for the scene. If Dawson thought he could pull this off, he was about to have the worst day of his career. Dawson crouched down beside the baggie, his expression carefully crafted, half smug, half feigned surprise. He picked it up between his gloved fingers and held it up for Jonathan to see, shaking his head like a disappointed father. "Well, well, what do we have here?" Jonathan's brow furrowed. His confusion was genuine, his body stiffening as his eyes darted to the small bag. "That's not mine," he said immediately, his voice firm but steady. Shaq, still standing a few feet away, exhaled slowly. He could already tell where this was going. He had seen too many stories like this. Dawson smirked, standing back up. "Really? 'Cause it was right next to your car." Jonathan took a careful step back. "I have no idea where that came from." Dawson sighed dramatically, shaking his head. "That's what they all say." Then in one swift motion, he reached for his handcuffs. "Turn around, hands behind your back." That was it. Shaq had been holding his tongue, watching, waiting, trying to give Dawson the benefit of the doubt. But now, he stepped forward, his massive frame moving with the kind of quiet control that made people nervous. His deep voice rumbled through the tense air. "That's funny," Shaq said, his tone casual but sharp. Because I just saw you drop that bag yourself. Everything stopped. Dawson's smirk wavered, his fingers hesitant. On the cuffs, for the first time since this whole charade began, he looked nervous. Jonathan turned toward Shaq, eyes widening in recognition. The bystanders, who had been hesitant to interfere, suddenly seemed more interested. A couple of them took out their phones. Dawson forced a laugh, but there was an edge to it. "Oh yeah, you a cop now?" Shaq took another step forward. Number just a guy with a good set of eyes. His stare bore into Dawson, unblinking. "And I know what I saw." Jonathan, emboldened by Shaq's presence, lifted his chin. "So do I. I never touched that bag." Dawson's grip on the cuffs tightened. His eyes darted around, checking the growing crowd. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. He had expected an easy arrest, a routine setup. He hadn't expected this. A woman nearby held up her phone. "I got it on video," she announced, her voice cutting through the air like a knife. Dawson's jaw clenched. Shaq folded his arms, his massive chest rising with a deep breath. "You want to rethink this, officer?" Dawson's hand twitched near his radio. Was he about to double down or make a run for it? Dawson's face twisted into a scowl, his confidence wavering for just a second. But then, like a man backed into a corner, he doubled down. "I don't know what you think you saw," Dawson snapped, his voice laced with forced authority. "But this man is under arrest." Jonathan flinched as Dawson grabbed his wrist, twisting his arm behind his back. "Are you serious?" Jonathan protested, struggling against the rough grip. "I didn't do anything." The cafe crowd murmured louder, phones now aimed directly at Dawson. The energy in the air was shifting fast. Shaq's eyes darkened. He took another step forward, towering over the officer like an immovable force. "You sure you want to do this?" His voice was calm, but there was an undeniable weight to it now. Dawson ignored him, pushing Jonathan against the hood of the car. "You have the right to remain—" "Hey!" a man in the crowd shouted. "We all saw what happened." "He planted that bag," a woman added, her phone held high. "You're on camera, dude." Dawson's jaw tightened. His fingers twitched around his cuffs. He was outnumbered, outmatched, but instead of backing down, he made the worst possible choice. His hand dropped to his taser. Shaq's entire body tensed. "Back off," Dawson growled, gripping the handle of his taser, eyes locked on Shaq. The energy in the air shifted. People gasped. Someone muttered, "Oh, hell no." Shaq didn't move, didn't even blink. "You really gonna tase me?" His voice was low, controlled, but filled with quiet warning. "In front of all these witnesses? With cameras rolling?" Dawson's breath hitched. Sweat beaded at his temple. The crowd pressed closer, outrage growing. Someone shouted, "This is illegal!" Another added, "You're done, bro!" Jonathan, still pinned against the car, struggled again. "This is crazy! Let me go!" Dawson's hand trembled over the taser. His mind was racing. He knew this was spiraling out of control, but his pride, his need to maintain power, wasn't letting him back down. Shaq slowly, deliberately took another step. "Think real hard before you make your next move." A few feet away, the cafe door swung open, and a waitress in a red apron hurried out. "Hey, we have security cameras too. It's all recorded inside." Dawson's face went pale. "Dude," another voice called out, this time from behind him. It was another officer, his partner, Officer Harris, standing by the squad car, his radio in hand. "Don't do this." Dawson turned his head slightly, his grip on the taser still tight. "Step away," Harris said, his voice firm. Dawson hesitated, his eyes flicking between Shaq, the growing crowd, and his partner. Just then, Dawson's radio crackled. "Unit 47, report your status." His backup was listening. Would he go through with it? Or was this the moment everything unraveled? Dawson's fingers twitched near his taser, his pride refusing to let him back down. But there was a problem. Shaq wasn't budging. He wasn't intimidated. And unlike everyone else Dawson had bullied, Shaq had an entire crowd behind him. Shaq stood tall, arms crossed, eyes locked onto Dawson like a predator watching its prey. "You know who I am?" His voice was calm, almost too calm. Dawson scoffed, his lips curling into a sneer. "I don't care." Shaq exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "You will." The tension in the air thickened. The cafe crowd was silent now, waiting, watching. The people recording held their phones up like shields, their cameras capturing every second. Jonathan, still pressed against the car, muttered, "This is insane." His voice was tight, frustration and disbelief swirling together. Dawson's hand was still hovering near his taser, but his confidence was starting to crack. His eyes flickered to his surroundings. Too many witnesses. Too many cameras. Shaq took a step forward, his massive frame making Dawson look like a child in comparison. "You sure you want to do this?" Shaq asked, his voice lowering into something deeper, something that sent a shiver down Dawson's spine. Dawson clenched his jaw, but his fingers twitched. The weight of the situation was finally sinking in. Then, sirens. The piercing wail of another police car filled the air, growing louder as it approached. Tires screeched against the pavement as a second squad car skidded to a stop just feet away. Dawson's radio crackled again. "Unit 47, report your status." His face paled. A door swung open and another officer stepped out, a senior one. His badge gleamed under the streetlights. Captain Reynolds. The crowd collectively held its breath. Reynolds scanned the scene. The people, the phones, Shaq's unyielding stance, and Jonathan still pinned against the car. His face hardened. "Dawson," Reynolds said, his voice edged with authority. "What the hell is going on here?" Dawson swallowed. His fingers finally drifted away from his taser, but the damage was already done. Shaq smirked slightly. He knew what was coming next. Reynolds turned to Shaq. "Would you mind telling me why half the city is watching this mess unfold?" Dawson stiffened at the question, his face twitching with barely concealed panic. His hand instinctively moved to his vest, where his body cam sat, but he didn't touch it. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, sensing the shift. Shaq, arms still crossed, tilted his head slightly. "Yeah, Dawson," he said, his voice slow and deliberate. "You do have body cam footage, right?" Dawson's lips parted, but no words came out. He was scrambling, trying to figure out his next move. Jenkins narrowed his eyes and took a step closer. The older officer had been on the force long enough to smell when something was off. "Let's go ahead and check that footage," he said, his tone neutral but firm. The air in the cafe parking lot was thick with anticipation. Jonathan, still pinned against his car, exhaled sharply. "Finally," he muttered under his breath. Dawson forced out a chuckle, but it didn't sound right. It was too high-pitched, too strained. "Look, Jenkins, I don't think that's necessary. I know what I saw." Jenkins didn't buy it. "And I'm sure the footage will back that up." Shaq took a slow step toward Dawson, towering over him. "What's the problem, officer?" he asked, voice dripping with sarcasm. "You seemed real confident a minute ago." Dawson's fingers twitched again. His mind was racing, but there was no way out. If he handed over the footage, it would expose everything. The planted drugs, the false arrest, the blatant abuse of power. He was trapped. Jenkins pulled out his radio. "Dispatch, I need confirmation that Officer Dawson's body cam has been recording this entire interaction." Silence, then. "Negative, Unit 47's body cam was manually deactivated 2 minutes ago." The crowd erupted. Gasps, shouts. Phones were now recording Dawson up close. Jonathan let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Wow, what a coincidence." Dawson's face flushed red. His jaw clenched so hard it looked like his teeth might snap. Jenkins' expression darkened. "Dawson," he said slowly, "tell me you didn't just—" "Enough!" Dawson snapped, his voice cracking under the pressure. "This is ridiculous. He had the drugs. I saw it." Shaq let out a deep, amused chuckle. "Man, you are really bad at this." Jenkins sighed, rubbing his temple. "Dawson, turn around." Dawson flinched. "Excuse me?" Jenkins nodded at another officer who had just arrived. "Cuff him." The crowd exploded. Cheers, laughter. Some people chanted, "Lock him up!" Dawson staggered back, eyes darting frantically, but there was nowhere to run. As the cuffs clicked shut, Dawson hissed, "You're making a big mistake." Jenkins shook his head. "No, Dawson, you did." Shaq held up his phone, the screen glowing as it continued to record. The entire crowd leaned in, the tension so thick it was nearly suffocating. Officer Dawson's face went through a series of rapid changes. Shock, realization, and then sheer panic. Jenkins crossed his arms. "Body cams malfunctioning?" His tone was laced with skepticism. "That's convenient." Dawson forced a chuckle, but it sounded weak. "Look, we don't have to make a big deal out of this," he said quickly, waving a dismissive hand. "Things get messy in the field." Shaq arched an eyebrow. "Messy?" His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. You planted drugs on an innocent man and tried to arrest him. That ain't messy. That's straight up corruption. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. People were shaking their heads, whispering to one another. Some even shouted out, "Fire him! Lock him up! This dude is dirty!" Jonathan, still leaning against his car, exhaled slowly. He had been tense this entire time, but now he could feel the shift. For the first time, Dawson wasn't in control. Jenkins took a slow step forward, his presence authoritative. "Dawson," he said, his voice eerily calm, "is there a reason you don't want us reviewing your body cam footage?" Dawson's eyes flickered to his chest where his camera was still attached. He swallowed hard. He stopped himself, jaw clenching. Shaq smirked. "You know, we could just check the footage." "Oh, wait." He snapped his fingers. "You turned it off, didn't you?" Dawson's breath came faster now. He turned to Jenkins, eyes pleading. "Look, Jenkins, you know how this job is. Sometimes we gotta make quick decisions. It's not always black and white." Jenkins' eyes narrowed. "You're right. It's not black and white." He gestured toward the crowd. "But this is as clear as day." Shaq's smirk deepened as he lifted his phone higher. "Guess I'll just send this to a few people, huh?" He tilted his head mockingly. "Maybe some news stations? A couple of lawyers?" Dawson paled, his hands curled into fists. "You don't want to do that," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Jenkins caught that. "Is that a threat, Dawson?" Dawson blinked rapidly, shaking his head. No, You just what?" Shaq cut in. "Realized you screwed up?" Dawson's entire body was stiff now. His career was flashing before his eyes. His pension, his reputation, everything gone in an instant. Jenkins exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. "Dawson, turn over your badge." The crowd gasped. Dawson's head snapped toward him. "What?" His voice cracked. "You heard me." Jenkins held out his hand. "Turn it in. Now." Dawson looked around wildly, as if searching for someone to save him. But there was no one. The department wasn't going to protect him from this. Not with Shaq's recording. Not with a crowd full of witnesses. Jonathan, still standing beside his car, let out a bitter chuckle. "Poetic justice," he muttered. Dawson let out a harsh breath, then reached for his badge with a shaking hand. He yanked it from his vest and slammed it into Jenkins' palm. "You're making a mistake," Dawson spat, his voice trembling with anger. Jenkins shook his head. "No, Dawson. You did." Just as Dawson turned to leave, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at it, and suddenly his face drained of all color. Something was very, very wrong. Shaq's fingers tapped the screen of his phone as he made the call, his face unreadable. The crowd murmured, some pulling out their own phones, sensing that whatever was about to happen would be big. Dawson scoffed, crossing his arms like a petulant child. "Who do you think you are?" His voice was laced with forced bravado, but the sweat glistening on his forehead betrayed his nerves. Shaq barely glanced at him, keeping the phone pressed to his ear. "Just a guy with 30 million followers," he said casually. The words landed like a gut punch. Dawson flinched, but quickly recovered, rolling his eyes. "What, you think you can just post a little video and ruin my life? Please." Shaq didn't even bother answering. He turned slightly, speaking into his phone. "Yo, I need you to check something out. Sending you a video right now." Dawson shifted uncomfortably, his hands fidgeting. His confidence was slipping, and everyone could see it. The crowd had grown, and now there were at least a dozen people recording, their cameras pointed squarely at the disgraced officer. Jenkins, still holding Dawson's badge, shook his head. "Man, you should have walked away when you had the chance." Dawson clenched his jaw, his eyes darting from Shaq to the surrounding bystanders. "This is harassment," he muttered. "I should sue all of you." Jonathan, still standing by his car, laughed bitterly. "Harassment? You planted evidence on me. How many others have you done this to?" Dawson ignored him. He wasn't thinking about Jonathan anymore. He wasn't thinking about Shaq or Jenkins either. Right now, he was only thinking about one thing. His phone had just vibrated in his pocket. He hesitated before pulling it out. The moment he did, his face drained of all color. The screen was flooded with notifications. "Shaq, watch this and tell me how y'all feel." Pinned tweet 12.4K, comments 56K, retweets 232K likes. And the worst part? The video was playing automatically. His own face stared back at him, smug and untouchable, until the moment Shaq had called him out. The camera had caught everything. The fake arrest, The planted baggie, the arrogance. Dawson's breathing grew shallow. Shaq's smile widened. Damn, that was fast. Jenkins looked over Dawson's shoulder and let out a low whistle. Oh yeah, you're done. Dawson's hands trembled as he scrolled through the replies. Real justice warrior. This is why we don't trust the system. Disgusting. Hoops King 23. Shaq really exposed this dude like it was Game 7. Expose corrupt cops. Hope he gets everything coming to him. Mayor Billings. We will be looking into this immediately. Dawson staggered backward, his chest tightening. His name was everywhere. Every major news outlet had picked up the video within minutes. Shaq tilted his head. Still want to sue? Dawson gritted his teeth, stuffing his phone back into his pocket like it would somehow make the nightmare go away. This isn't over, he hissed. Shaq's expression hardened. Oh, trust me, it is. Before Dawson can make another move, a black SUV screeches to a stop nearby. The doors fly open, and out steps the police commissioner. The situation was spiraling out of control, at least for Dawson. Every second that passed, more people crowded around, their phones pointed at him like 100 watchful eyes. The video had already gone viral. Dawson's own face was plastered across social media, his smug grin now frozen in time as evidence of his corruption. Live streams on Instagram and TikTok were blowing up. Justice for All, live, 37.2K viewers. Yo, this dirty cop just got caught. Shaq is right here exposing him. The truth hurts. Tag the mayor. Get this man fired. Garce City Watch News. Breaking viral video shows officer accused of planting evidence. Mayor's office is reviewing. Dawson could barely breathe. He felt the walls closing in, the whispers growing louder. His name was trending. Hashtag Dawson exposed, and not in a good way. He turned back towards Shaq, who was just standing there, arms crossed, as if he already knew how this would end. This is harassment, Dawson barked, voice cracking. You're all turning this into something it's not. Jenkins, the older officer, let out a sharp laugh. Nah, Dawson, you did that to yourself. Dawson was about to snap back when another sound cut through the chaos. More sirens. A third police car pulled up to the curb, its lights flashing ominously. But this time it wasn't backup for Dawson. The doors swung open, and out stepped two men in dark suits, their expressions unreadable. One of them, a tall, broad-shouldered man with silver hair, adjusted his badge, Internal Affairs. Dawson's stomach dropped. The lead investigator, Agent Monroe, looked straight at Jenkins. We saw the footage. Where is he? Jenkins didn't hesitate. He simply pointed at Dawson. The corrupt cop tried to backpedal. I was just following protocol. He let out a nervous chuckle. These accusations are insane. You can't seriously think. Monroe cut him off with a single look. Sergeant Dawson, you're being placed on administrative leave effective immediately. Dawson's face turned beet red. Are you kidding me? Shaq took a slow step forward, his massive frame towering over Dawson like an unshakable force. Not so fun when the tables turn, huh? Jonathan, still standing beside his car, folded his arms. I want a public apology, he said, and I want my name cleared now. Monroe nodded. That's already happening. Mr. Carter, you were never under investigation. The charges are being dropped as we speak. Dawson's breathing turned shallow. His mind raced, looking for an escape. Wait, he blurted out. Let's talk about this. Bang! The sound wasn't a gunshot, but it might as well have been. The police chief's black SUV screeched to a stop at the scene. The doors flew open, and out stepped the police chief himself. His face was like stone. Dawson, my office. Now. The moment Dawson saw the Internal Affairs officers approaching, his entire body went rigid. His pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out the murmurs from the growing crowd. This wasn't just some routine slap on the wrist. This was serious. The lead investigator, Agent Monroe, didn't hesitate. He extended a hand. Sergeant Dawson, hand over your badge and service weapon. Effective immediately, you are placed under investigation for falsifying evidence. Dawson's face drained of color. Wait, this is ridiculous, he blurted out. You can't just... Monroe's tone sharpened. Now. Dawson's fingers trembled as he unlatched his badge from his belt, the reality sinking in like quicksand. He hesitated with his gun. His eyes darted toward Jenkins, who had been watching with a smirk. Give me a reason, Jenkins muttered under his breath, flexing his fingers near his own holster. Dawson exhaled sharply and finally handed over the weapon. Shaq, still standing tall beside Jonathan, watched the entire exchange with a grim expression. He had seen people like Dawson before, men who abused their authority, believing they were untouchable. But the world was watching now, and there was no escaping accountability. A hush fell over the street as Jenkins took a step forward, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. "Rick Dawson," he said, voice steady but firm, "you're under arrest for falsifying evidence, misconduct, and abuse of power. You have the right to remain silent." That's when Dawson snapped, "Hell no!" In an instant, he spun on his heel and bolted. Gasps erupted from the crowd as Dawson sprinted toward the alley behind the cafe, shoving people out of the way. Shaq reacted first. "Oh, you gotta be kidding me." Without a second thought, Shaq took off after him, and despite Dawson's head start, he never stood a chance. The difference between their strides was night and day. Dawson's frantic, erratic movements against Shaq's long, powerful strides. Within seconds, the gap closed. "Move!" Dawson barked, shoving past a bystander. Bad idea. Shaq didn't hesitate. He reached out, grabbed the back of Dawson's collar, and yanked him backward. Dawson's legs flew out from under him, and he crashed onto the pavement with a hard thud. Groaning, he tried to scramble up, but Shaq placed one massive hand on his back, effortlessly keeping him pinned. Jenkins and Monroe arrived seconds later, guns drawn, but the fight was already over. "Dumbass," Jenkins muttered. He holstered his weapon and pulled out the cuffs again. "You just made this 10 times worse," Dawson thrashed. "Get off me! You're making a mistake! I'm the victim here!" Shaq leaned down, lowering his voice. "Nah, man. The only mistake here was yours." Monroe clicked his radio. "Chief, we got him." But over the radio, the chief's voice came through, tight and furious. "Get him to my office, now." Dawson's breath came in ragged gasps as he shoved Jenkins with all his might, sending the officer stumbling back. Without thinking, he turned on his heel and bolted. His heart pounded as he sprinted toward the parking lot. If he could just make it to his car, he could disappear. Maybe even leave the city. He'd figure out the rest later. But Dawson's problem wasn't the cops chasing him. It was the 7-foot-tall problem standing directly in his path. Shaq didn't move. He stood firm, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Dawson barely had time to react before, bam! He slammed into Shaq's chest like a car hitting a brick wall. The impact sent Dawson sprawling backward onto the pavement. He groaned, dazed, blinking up at the towering figure above him. Shaq didn't even flinch. He just raised an eyebrow. "Really?" Dawson tried scrambling up again, but Shaq placed one massive foot on his chest, pinning him down. Jenkins jogged up, still catching his breath, shaking his head. "You're just full of bad decisions today, huh?" Dawson thrashed. "Get off me! You're assaulting an officer!" Shaq let out a slow, unimpressed chuckle. "Man, you ain't an officer no more." Monroe approached, handcuffs glinting in the streetlight. "We're done here, Dawson." Dawson wasn't listening. His mind was racing. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He had been the one in control, the guy with the power. How had it turned into this? But before he could process, Shaq lifted his foot, and Jenkins and Monroe yanked him up, forcing his hands behind his back. The cold bite of steel snapped around his wrists. "You're under arrest for resisting, obstruction, and falsifying evidence," Monroe said flatly. "And that's just for starters," Dawson snarled. "You think this is over? I know people. I'll be back on the force in a week." Shaq tilted his head. "You sure about that?" A black SUV pulled up, tires screeching. The doors swung open and out stepped the police chief himself. His expression? Lethal. Dawson slumped in the back of the squad car, wrist-bound, eyes darting wildly between the officers. His mind raced, desperate for an escape. A loophole. Anything that could undo the last 15 minutes. But it was over. Really over. Jenkins slammed the door shut. "Enjoy your ride, Dawson," he muttered, shaking his head. Dawson sneered. "You'll regret this." Jenkins leaned in, his voice deadly calm. "Nah, I think you're the one with regrets." Shaq stood nearby, watching in silence as Dawson's world collapsed. The officer had dug himself into a hole so deep, not even the dirtiest lawyers in the city could pull him out. The moment felt heavier than the chaos before it. The night air was thick with something unspoken, something powerful. Then, Jonathan stepped forward. He extended his hand toward Shaq, his voice steady but filled with gratitude. I owe you, man. Shaq didn't hesitate. He gripped Jonathan's hand firmly, pulling him in for a shoulder bump. Nah, Shaq said, shaking his head. You don't owe me nothing. Jonathan exhaled, relief washing over him. I don't even know what would have happened if you hadn't been here. Shaq locked eyes with him, his voice lowering. Yeah, you do. A brief silence stretched between them. Jonathan swallowed hard. He did know, and it terrified him. Shaq patted Jonathan on the shoulder. But don't let this stop you. Jonathan nodded, determination settling into his features. Then out of nowhere, a voice cut through the night. Shaq, over here! A journalist rushed forward, microphone in hand, camera crew scrambling behind her. The moment had gone viral, and now the world wanted answers. Shaq, why'd you step in? She pressed, eyes burning with curiosity. The crowd hushed. Even the officers paused to listen. Shaq exhaled, rolling his shoulders. He glanced at the cameras, then at Dawson, then back to Jonathan. Finally, he looked straight into the lens. Because I could, Shaq said simply. And if you can, you should. The cameras kept rolling. But Shaq, he was already walking away, leaving the world to talk. By morning, the world knew what had happened. The video of Shaq stopping Dawson had gone viral, spreading across every major platform. News stations picked it up, and hashtags flooded social media. Shaq stops corruption, justice for Jonathan, not on Shaq's watch. Articles appeared within hours. Shaquille O'Neal confronts corrupt cop, and the internet reacts. NBA legend calls out injustice in shocking viral video. The footage had everything: a blatant abuse of power, a celebrity stepping in, and justice unfolding in real time. Millions had watched as Shaq exposed Dawson. Millions more were demanding action. The police department issued a public statement before noon. Officer Rick Dawson has been placed on administrative leave, pending an internal investigation. The department does not tolerate misconduct, but the damage had already been done. As the investigation expanded, Dawson's past complaints resurfaced: excessive force, racial profiling, falsifying reports. All of it had been swept under the rug until now. With so many eyes on the case, the department had no choice. Dawson was suspended indefinitely, and sources hinted that termination was inevitable. He had spent years thinking he was untouchable. Now his career was crumbling in front of him. Jonathan Carter had spent his life working hard, playing by the rules. Yet in one moment, he had nearly lost everything because of a lie. But now the tables had turned. That afternoon, he received an unexpected call. "This is Mayor Andrews," the voice said. "I wanted to personally apologize for what happened to you." Jonathan was stunned. In all his years, he had never expected something like this. An apology? From the mayor? "We're reviewing policies and procedures," the mayor continued. "This shouldn't have happened, and we'll make sure it doesn't happen again." Jonathan listened, still in disbelief. After everything, someone was finally holding the system accountable. Under mounting pressure, the department was now forced to take action. Internal Affairs launched an internal review, and city officials pushed for major reforms. The usual silence that followed cases like this was nowhere to be found. This time, people were watching, demanding answers, expecting change. Some officers resented the attention. Others welcomed it, relieved that the culture of cover-ups was finally being exposed. But for Shaq, the outcome was clear. Things were shifting. That evening, outside a charity event, reporters swarmed Shaq, microphones raised. "Shaq, did you plan this? Do you think Dawson will be fired? How does it feel knowing you changed everything?" Shaq exhaled, shaking his head. "Man, all I did was tell the truth." The cameras flashed. The story had gone far beyond him now, and for the first time in a long time, it looked like the truth was enough.